She was the last pharaoh of Egypt, a queen born into a fading dynasty, ruling a kingdom rich but fragile. He was Rome's most brilliant general, fresh from conquering Gaul and on the brink of civil war. When Cleopatra VII and Julius Caesar met in 48 BCE, their worlds were already colliding, Egypt struggling to remain independent, Rome tearing itself apart. Their alliance, personal, political, and deeply strategic, would change the fate of both empires. The story we usually hear about Cleopatra is drenched in myth. Later Roman writers painted her as a seductress who bewitched Caesar and, later, Mark Antony. Shakespeare gave us the image of an exotic temptress whose beauty toppled great men. But the real Cleopatra was something far more formidable. A multilingual, highly educated ruler navigating the most dangerous power politics of the ancient world. The story of how she met Caesar and used him to save her throne, while Caesar used her to anchor Rome's influence in the East, is as much about strategy and survival as romance. To understand how the two crossed paths, we must start with a fractured Egypt. The Ptolemaic dynasty, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, had ruled for nearly 3 centuries. They were Macedonian Greeks ruling an Egyptian population, blending Greek and Egyptian traditions, but often remaining aloof. By the 1st century BCE, the dynasty was weak, mired in court intrigue and sibling rivalries. Cleopatra herself was the daughter of Ptolemy XIII Auletes, a king who spent lavishly to buy Roman support and left Egypt heavily in debt. When Auletes died in 51 BCE, he left the throne jointly to his 18-year-old daughter Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy X. They were to marry, as was Ptolemaic custom, and rule together. But behind the throne stood powerful courtiers who favored the boy king. Soon Cleopatra was pushed aside. By 48 BCE, she was in exile in Syria, raising a small army to reclaim her birthright. At the same moment, Julius Caesar was embroiled in the Roman Civil War. After defeating Pompey at Pharsalus in Greece, Pompey fled to Egypt seeking refuge. Egypt's regents, advisors to young Ptolemy VI, made a fatal decision. To impress Caesar, they murdered Pompey and presented his severed head. Caesar, arriving soon after, was not pleased. Pompey had been his rival, but also his son-in-law, and a great Roman statesman. The killing offended Caesar's sense of Roman dignity and gave him an excuse to intervene in Egypt's politics. Caesar entered Alexandria in 48 BCE with a small force, ostensibly to settle the dynastic dispute between Cleopatra and her brother. He took up residence in the royal palace and summoned the siblings to present their claims. For Cleopatra, this was an opportunity and danger. She was barred from the city by her enemies. Legend says she had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters, rolled in a carpet or bedding sack, the famous dramatic entrance. Whatever the exact details, she managed to meet Caesar privately and make her case. This meeting was pivotal. Cleopatra was no ordinary petitioner. She spoke many languages, understood statecraft, and could charm without subservience. Caesar, in his 50s, weary from war and politics, saw in her both personal fascination and political utility. Supporting Cleopatra meant rewarding the sibling who had not insulted Rome by murdering Pompey. It gave Caesar influence over Egypt's wealth and grain, vital to feeding Rome. Caesar declared his support for Cleopatra's claim to joint rule with her brother. But Ptolemy X's advisors resisted. Fighting broke out in Alexandria, the Alexandrian War. Caesar, though outnumbered, held the palace quarter and harbor with his veteran troops. Cleopatra stayed with him, forging an alliance sealed by politics and, by ancient accounts, intimacy. As the war dragged on, reinforcements arrived from Asia Minor. Ptolemy X's forces were defeated, and the boy king drowned, fleeing the battle. Cleopatra emerged victorious. She was restored as queen, now with her even younger brother Ptolemy X as ceremonial co-ruler. Caesar remained months in Egypt, consolidating his allies' position and enjoying her court. During this time, Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Ptolemy V Philopator Philometor Caesar, known to Romans as Caesarion, Little Caesar. Ancient gossip claimed Caesar was the father, though he never formally acknowledged the boy. This episode mattered far beyond personal drama. Caesar's stay in Egypt projected Roman power deep into the eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra secured her throne and Egypt's relative independence under Roman shadow. Their partnership was calculated. Cleopatra needed Rome's might. Caesar needed Egypt's grain and wealth to finance his next campaigns. Yet the story was far from over. Caesar soon returned to Rome to face new wars and politics, and Cleopatra would later follow, arriving in Rome as an exotic but politically potent guest, and target of Roman gossip. Her connection to Caesar linked her fate to his, and after his assassination, her world would change again. The tale of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar is often reduced to romance, but its real force lies in survival and ambition. It is the story of a young queen using intelligence and audacity to secure her throne in a world dominated by foreign empires, and of a Roman general seeing advantage in alliance with an ancient kingdom. It begins with exile and danger, passes through palace intrigue and urban warfare, and sets the stage for one of history's most dramatic love affairs and political gambles. This is that untold story, not just a tale of beauty and charm, but of power, statecraft, and the meeting of two extraordinary worlds on the edge of an empire. Before Cleopatra ever met Julius Caesar, she inherited a kingdom with a long, troubled past and a precarious present. To understand her decisions and the stakes of her alliance with Rome, we must step into Egypt at the twilight of the Ptolemies, a land still rich and ancient, but deeply entangled in the politics of the Mediterranean world. The Ptolemaic dynasty began after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE. His empire fractured among his generals. Ptolemy the Sursota took Egypt and built a Greco-Macedonian royal house that ruled for nearly 3 centuries. These kings styled themselves pharaohs and adopted some Egyptian traditions, but remained fundamentally Hellenistic monarchs, speaking Greek and relying on Greek elites. They built Alexandria into a dazzling capital, with its great library, lighthouse, and cosmopolitan port. But the Greek ruling class stayed largely separate from the native Egyptian population. Early Ptolemies had been powerful and wealthy. Egypt's fertile Nile Valley produced abundant grain, feeding both its own people and foreign markets. Alexandria was the Mediterranean's commercial hub, but by the 1st century BCE, this prosperity was faltering. Dynastic inbreeding and intrigue weakened the royal family. Successive kings squandered wealth on court luxury, foreign wars, and bribes to secure Roman favor. Rome itself had risen from a regional Italian power to master of the Mediterranean, and Egypt increasingly existed at Rome's mercy. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy III Auletes, the flute player, embodied this decline. He was known for lavish spending and weak leadership. Facing threats from rival claimants and restless Egyptians, he clung to power by cultivating Rome. In 59 BCE, he paid the Roman dictator Julius Caesar, SLI Pompey, enormous bribes to have his kingship recognized by the Senate. The cost was staggering. Egypt's treasury was drained, taxes rose, and resentment deepened among both Greeks and Egyptians. When Auletes was driven into exile by local uprisings in 58 BCE, Rome intervened on his behalf. He returned to power with Roman help, further indebted and despised. By the time he died in 51 BCE, leaving the throne to his teenage children Cleopatra and Ptolemy VI, Egypt was still rich in resources but politically fragile, economically strained, and vulnerable to Roman influence. It was a kingdom with ancient prestige but little true independence. Cleopatra VII was born around 69 BCE, the second daughter of Auletes. Her upbringing, while royal, was shaped by crisis. She grew up amid court conspiracies and Roman manipulation, likely aware from an early age that survival required intelligence and adaptability. Ancient sources emphasize her education. Unlike most of her Greek-speaking dynasty, Cleopatra reportedly learned the Egyptian language in addition to Greek and other tongues. She was said to be fluent in several languages spoken across the eastern Mediterranean, a skill that made her unique among her house and able to speak directly to many subjects and allies. When Auletes died, Cleopatra was about 18 and her brother husband Ptolemy III around 10. A regency of court officials effectively controlled the boy king. The co-rule was a fiction from the start. Cleopatra initially took the lead, appearing alone on some documents and coins, suggesting she tried to assert sole authority. But this provoked the palace elite, especially the powerful eunuch Pothinus, the general Achilles, and the rhetorician Theodotus of Chios, who managed the young Ptolemy. By 48 BCE, they pushed Cleopatra out, forcing her into exile. Her exile was not a passive retreat. Cleopatra regrouped in Syria, raising an army from mercenaries and loyal supporters. She planned to invade and reclaim her throne. This was risky. She had little money, and mercenary forces could be unreliable. But it shows her will and resourcefulness. She did not accept defeat or wait for events. She tried to act. Meanwhile, Egypt's court was making fatal choices. The Roman civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey spilled into the eastern Mediterranean. Pompey, defeated by Caesar at Pharsalus in 48 BCE, sailed to Egypt seeking refuge, thinking his past patronage of Auletes would secure safety. Instead, Pothinus and his faction saw a chance to win Caesar's favor cheaply. They murdered Pompey as he landed, sending his severed head and signet ring to Caesar. This was a grave miscalculation. Roman political culture respected the dignity of high office even in civil war. Caesar, though enemy to Pompey, was angered by the dishonorable killing of a Roman consul and great general, and by foreigners meddling in Roman affairs. He arrived soon after with a small but elite force, officially to arbitrate the sibling kingship dispute, but now with his own reasons to punish those who had insulted Rome. For Cleopatra, this sudden Roman intervention was both danger and opportunity. She had been preparing to fight her brother militarily. Now Caesar's presence offered another path. But reaching him was not simple. Her enemies controlled Alexandria and barred her entry. Here comes the famous tale, likely embroidered but with a core of truth, of Cleopatra's secret arrival. Ancient sources describe her being smuggled into Caesar's quarters, hidden in bedding or a rolled carpet, unrolling before the Roman general as a dramatic surprise. Whether or not the detail is exact, the strategy was clear. She took a calculated risk to meet Caesar privately and plead her cause. Cleopatra's gamble worked because she was more than a desperate exile. She presented herself as a legitimate pharaoh, charismatic and politically shrewd. Ancient writers, even hostile ones, emphasize her intellect and charm rather than just beauty. She could converse as an equal, discussing statecraft, finances, and diplomacy. For Caesar, a man who prized intelligence and had an eye for power, she was impressive. Caesar also had cold political reasons to support her. Backing Cleopatra allowed him to counter the faction that had offended Rome by killing Pompey. It promised him influence in wealthy Egypt, whose grain could feed Rome's masses and whose money could fund his next campaigns. Caesar was in the middle of a civil war and needed resources. An allied queen on the Nile was valuable. The stage was thus set for the Alexandrian War, where Caesar would face Pothinus, Achilles, and the boy king's forces, while Cleopatra became his ally and partner. But to grasp how daring Cleopatra's move was, we must remember her position. A young woman, exiled, with few troops and little cash, choosing to stake everything on persuading the most powerful Roman alive. She was not merely seducing, she was negotiating survival and sovereignty. Egypt itself made her task urgent. The country was wealthy but politically brittle. Its Greek elite distrusted Rome but relied on it. Its native population had long been alienated from the Ptolemaic rulers. Taxation was heavy. Famines could spark unrest. Rome's appetite for grain was relentless. Whoever ruled Egypt had to balance domestic stability with keeping Rome satisfied, enough not to annex the kingdom outright. Cleopatra stepped into this minefield with intelligence and audacity. She was willing to risk a bold personal encounter to reclaim her throne and secure her kingdom face independence, or at least its autonomy under Roman protection. That decision would define the rest of her reign and her entanglement with Rome's greatest men. By the time Caesar and Cleopatra finally met in Alexandria, she had already shown the resilience, cultural fluency, and political nerve that would make her unforgettable. She was not yet the legend, but the qualities that would feed that legend were already in motion. When Cleopatra slipped into Caesar's quarters in Alexandria in 48 BCE, she was taking the greatest gamble of her life. She arrived as an exiled queen with few troops and fewer allies, facing a hostile court led by her brother Ptolemy V and his powerful advisors. Julius Caesar, in his early 50s and already the most accomplished Roman alive, had come to Egypt with only a small veteran force, perhaps 0 men, to settle a dynastic dispute and to assert Roman dignity after the murder of Pompey. Both figures needed something. Cleopatra needed her throne. Caesar needed control, money, and a justification for his presence. The meeting was a clash of two worlds. Cleopatra had been raised in the treacherous Ptolemaic court, where survival depended on intelligence and charm. She was about 21 years old, multilingual, politically astute, and fully aware that Rome now decided Egypt's fate. Caesar was weary but ambitious, fresh from civil war victory, yet needing cash and grain to secure Rome. Later Roman writers turned this encounter into melodrama, a beautiful queen unfurling from a carpet to captivate a conqueror. But beneath the romance lay practical calculation. Cleopatra presented herself not just as a claimant, but as a useful partner. Caesar responded quickly. He summoned both siblings and declared his intention to enforce their father's will. Cleopatra and Ptolemy III should reign jointly. This infuriated the boy king's regents, especially Pothinus, the eunuch advisor who had ordered Pompey's murder, and the general Achillas. They had hoped Caesar would be grateful for Pompey's death and confirm their power. Instead, he appeared to back Cleopatra. Tensions snapped into open war. Thus began the Alexandrian War, a complex urban siege fought street by street in one of the ancient world's greatest cities. Caesar and his small force seized the royal palace district and the harbor, using Alexandria's waterways as defenses. Pothinus and Achillas rallied the Egyptian army and much of the city against them. Cleopatra stayed with Caesar inside the palace, forging an alliance sealed, according to ancient accounts, by a personal relationship. The two were now politically bound. If Caesar lost, Cleopatra would die or return to exile. If he won, she would rule. The fighting was brutal and improvisational. Caesar had veteran legionaries, but few in number. Achillas commanded thousands and knew the city. Caesar burned parts of the harbor to deny ships to his enemies. In the process, some of the great library scrolls were likely destroyed, a tragedy remembered for centuries. He fortified positions, built makeshift siege engines, and relied on discipline to hold off larger forces. The Egyptians tried to cut his water supply and attack from land and sea. During this struggle, Pothinus was captured and executed after allegedly conspiring to open the gates to the enemy. But the war continued under a new commander, Ganymedes, who used Alexandria's canals to flood Caesar's positions. Caesar barely avoided disaster more than once, retreating and counterattacking with skill honed in Gaul. Reinforcements were crucial. Caesar had sent urgent messages to allies in Asia Minor and Syria. Relief came under Mithridates of Pergamon, who marched overland with troops and Roman allies. Caesar broke out of his trapped quarter to join these reinforcements and then turned on the Egyptian army in open battle. The decisive clash came early in 47 BCE near the Nile Delta. Caesar's legions, though outnumbered, crushed Ptolemy's forces through superior discipline and tactics. Ptolemy XIII himself drowned in the Nile while fleeing, a dramatic end for the boy king who had tried to oust his sister. With him gone and his faction broken, Cleopatra's victory was complete. Caesar now acted as arbiter of Egypt's throne. He installed Cleopatra as queen, pairing her formally with her even younger brother Ptolemy XV to maintain dynastic tradition. In practice, Cleopatra ruled. Her intelligence and ability to navigate Roman power impressed Caesar enough that he lingered in Egypt for months after the war, a rare pause for a man usually in constant campaign. During this time, Cleopatra and Caesar cemented their alliance. Ancient sources say they took a luxurious cruise up the Nile aboard a grand barge, inspecting temples and displaying their union to the people. The spectacle served politics. Cleopatra showed her subjects that Rome, the new superpower, stood behind her. Caesar, in turn, enjoyed Egypt's wealth and exotic prestige while securing grain supplies and treasure to fund his coming wars. By the time he departed, Cleopatra was pregnant with a son later known as Caesarion. The relationship was controversial in Rome. Caesar was still married, though estranged, and Romans distrusted powerful foreign queens. Yet for Caesar the calculus was simple. Cleopatra was now his client monarch, grateful and dependent. Egypt would remain nominally independent, but effectively allied and pliable. Its wealth could help pay Caesar's troops and feed Rome's growing population. The Alexandrian War also revealed Caesar's audacity. He had entered a hostile city with a small force, faced a massive local army, and emerged victorious through speed, engineering, and resolve. For Cleopatra, it was proof that betting on Caesar had saved her life and crown. She had risked everything on one Roman and won. It's important to note what Cleopatra gained beyond survival. She re-established herself as sole effective ruler, removing dangerous courtiers and neutralizing her brother's faction. She secured Egypt's autonomy at a time when Rome was annexing kingdoms. She gained a powerful Roman patron with unmatched prestige, and she ensured her dynasty's continuation through her son, linking the Ptolemies to Caesar's line, a symbolic bridge between Egypt and Rome. Yet her position remained delicate. She ruled a country exhausted by taxation and famine, its native population long alienated by Greek overlords. Rome's appetite for resources was insatiable. Her independence existed only because Caesar allowed it. And Caesar himself was walking into further civil war back home. Cleopatra's fate was now tied to his. Caesar left Egypt in the spring of 47 BCE to campaign in Asia Minor, famously declaring Veni, Vidi, Vici after swift victory at Zela. Cleopatra stayed behind to consolidate power and give birth to Caesarion. For the next few years, she ruled carefully, balancing traditional Egyptian imagery, portraying herself as a pharaoh and goddess, with Greek court culture that appealed to her elite. She also positioned herself as a loyal friend to Rome, hoping her alliance with Caesar would shield her from annexation. This period marks Cleopatra's first great act of survival and statecraft. She turned exile into triumph, civil war into opportunity, and personal charm into political leverage. Roman propaganda would later paint her as a seductress who bewitched men, but the facts show calculation. She recognized the real center of power and forged an alliance that let Egypt endure in a dangerous age. For Caesar, the Egyptian adventure was one of many exploits on his road to supreme power, but it left a lasting mark. His connection to Cleopatra would shadow him in Roman politics, feeding gossip and resentment among conservatives who feared Eastern luxuries and strong queens. Still, Caesar returned to Rome stronger and richer than before. The next act of their story would move to Rome itself. Cleopatra would travel there with Caesarion, appearing as an exotic queen in the heart of the Republic, while Caesar consolidated power as dictator for life. Their fates, already intertwined, would be tested by Rome's deadly politics and by the daggers of the Ides of March. When Julius Caesar sailed away from Egypt in 47 BCE, he left behind a secure ally and a queen who owed him everything. Cleopatra had regained her throne, eliminated her brother's hostile court, and given birth to a son, Ptolemy XV Caesar, whom she called Caesarion. Whether or not Caesar privately acknowledged the boy, the name alone declared a claim. For Cleopatra, this was both protection and ambition. If Caesar remained Rome's master, her dynasty might endure, even rise. Caesar, meanwhile, returned to a republic he had shaken to its core. He was now dictator, victor over Pompey, master of Rome's legions, and the most powerful man alive. But not yet a king. Rome was still proud of its republican traditions, suspicious of monarchy, and wary of foreign entanglements. Into this tense political world, Cleopatra would soon step, bringing with her wealth, beauty, intellect, and a living symbol of Caesar's reach beyond Italy. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra traveled to Rome with her young brother husband, Ptolemy XV, still a child, and her infant son, Caesarion. Officially, she came as an ally and client monarch, a foreign sovereign paying respect to the man who had restored her. Unofficially, her presence was sensational. The Roman public was fascinated by Egypt, its ancient temples, gods, and fabulous wealth, and Cleopatra embodied that mystique. Yet she also embodied what many senators feared, a powerful queen influencing their leader. Caesar housed Cleopatra and her entourage across the Tiber River in one of his estates. Ancient writers report that she stayed there openly, not hidden. Statues of Cleopatra as the goddess Isis were even set up in Caesar as new temple to Venus Genitrix. For conservatives, this was provocative. Rome had a long-standing fear of kings and Eastern luxury. Now their dictator was keeping a foreign queen, perhaps his lover, perhaps the mother of his child, in the capital itself. Public opinion was divided. Ordinary Romans loved spectacle and were intrigued by this queen who spoke many languages and carried herself like a living deity. Poets and gossips spread tales of her charm. But the Senate's old guard, already alarmed by Caesar's accumulation of titles and honors, saw danger. Caesar had just been named dictator for 10 years, then dictator for life. He wore royal purple, placed his image on coins, and accepted honors that seemed almost kingly. Rumors swirled that he might move the capital east to Alexandria, crown himself monarch, or marry Cleopatra and unite Rome with Egypt. Some of these fears were exaggerated, but Caesar's behavior fed them. He invited Cleopatra to lavish banquets, consulted her on political matters, and perhaps contemplated using Egypt's immense wealth to fund further ambitions. Cleopatra herself played the role shrewdly. She presented Egypt not as a threat, but as a loyal, cultured ally. Yet she also showcased its splendor, making clear that alliance with her brought riches and stability. Her presence placed Caesar's Roman wife, Calpurnia, in a humiliating position, though she remained publicly dutiful. Cleopatra did not appear to seek marriage. She knew Rome's hatred of queens. But she likely hoped Caesar would formalize Caesarian's status, or at least protect Egypt firmly. For her, every moment in Rome was investment, securing Egypt's future by binding it to Caesar's fortune. Meanwhile, Caesar was reshaping Rome with breathtaking speed. He reformed the calendar into the Julian system, reorganized provinces, planned vast building works, and prepared campaigns against Parthia to avenge Crassus's defeat at Carrhae. He was turning the tottering republic into something new, a personal regime backed by army and wealth. Yet he left little room for the pride and traditions of Rome's old aristocracy. His mercy to defeated foes, while generous, also humiliated them. His public honors seemed to mock the Senate's dignity. Conspiracies simmered. Many senators feared not only Caesar's power, but the possibility of a dynasty, a foreign dynasty at that. The sight of Cleopatra and Caesarion in Rome crystallized those anxieties. If Caesar named the boy his heir, Rome might one day be ruled by an Egyptian-blooded monarch. Ancient writers later claimed that this prospect spurred some conspirators. In February 44th BCE, Caesar accepted more unprecedented honors. His image carried in religious processions, his seat placed above others in the Senate, his birthday celebrated as a festival. Some whispered he would soon take the title Rex, King. Then came a strange omen, the festival of Lupercalia, where his ally Mark Antony publicly offered him a diadem, a symbol of kingship. Caesar refused it, but many saw the gesture as testing public opinion. The Senate's fear hardened into action. On the Ides of March 15th, 44 BCE, a group of senators led by Brutus and Cassius assassinated Caesar in the theater of Pompey. They struck him 23 times, proclaiming the death of tyranny and the restoration of the Republic. But instead of restoring freedom, they plunged Rome into chaos. Cleopatra was still in the city when news arrived. For her, the assassination was catastrophic. She had built her strategy entirely around Caesar's protection. Now he was gone, and his killers were powerful senators. Worse, Caesar had named as his heir not Caesarion, but his great-nephew Gaius Octavius, the future Augustus. Cleopatra and her son were nowhere in the will. Her gamble seemed suddenly hollow. She reacted cautiously. Cleopatra did not side with the assassins. She quietly slipped out of Rome and returned to Egypt, taking her son and wealth with her. Her survival instincts served her again. Rome was about to erupt in civil war, and she needed to consolidate power at home. Soon after returning, she likely arranged the death of Ptolemy XV, replacing him with the infant Caesarion as co-ruler. This made her sole effective sovereign and positioned her son, Caesar as possible child, as her dynastic partner. In Rome, chaos deepened. The assassins hoped to restore the Republic, but lacked a plan. Mark Antony, Caesar's ally and consul, seized control of Caesar's papers and funds. Octavian, the unexpected teenage heir, began maneuvering brilliantly. Civil war loomed once again. For Cleopatra, watching from Alexandria, a new question emerged. Which Roman would replace Caesar as master of the Mediterranean? And how could she protect Egypt from the storm? The months Cleopatra spent in Rome had been more than spectacle. They exposed her to the full complexity of Roman politics, its resentful aristocracy, its volatile crowds, and its emerging reality that one man, not the old republic, would rule. She had seen how quickly power could turn and how dangerous Rome's jealousy of monarchy could be. She had also seen that wealth, spectacle, and personal influence could sway events but not guarantee safety. Now she faced a transformed world. Caesar was dead, his heir was young but ambitious, and Mark Antony held Caesar's armies and loyalty. Cleopatra had wealth, prestige, and Caesarion, but no clear protector. Her challenge was to navigate this new Roman civil war, just as she had the last one, to find again the ally who could secure Egypt. Her next move would bring her into alliance with Mark Antony, Caesar's brilliant but flawed lieutenant. Together they would form one of history's most famous and doomed partnerships, a union of passion and politics that would provoke Rome's final war of the Republic. But before that story begins, Cleopatra had to survive the vacuum left by Caesar's fall and decide which rising Roman would shape her destiny. After Julius Caesar's assassination, the Mediterranean became a chessboard of shifting alliances. Cleopatra, newly widowed of her brother Ptolemy XIV and now sole ruler with her infant son Caesarion, faced a world without her Roman protector. She ruled a still wealthy but vulnerable Egypt, watched by powerful Roman factions desperate for cash and grain. Her survival would depend once again on choosing the right Roman to back. And this time, the choice would define the last years of the Republic. In Rome, Caesar's murderers, led by Brutus and Cassius, claimed to be liberators. But they underestimated two men, Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted lieutenant and consul, and Gaius Octavius, Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old great-nephew and adopted heir. Antony controlled Caesar's veterans and wealth. Octavian controlled his name and legal succession. Both sought to avenge Caesar and claim his legacy. By 43 BCE, these two, along with Marcus Lepidus, formed the Second Triumvirate, an official three-man dictatorship to stabilize Rome and punish the assassins. Together they launched brutal proscriptions, killing enemies and seizing wealth. Brutus and Cassius were crushed at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. The Republic's last defenders died or fled, but peace did not follow. Antony and Octavian, having defeated a common enemy, soon turned on each other. Antony took the eastern provinces as his sphere. This brought him into contact with the wealthy client kingdoms, including Egypt. Octavian remained in the west, controlling Italy and Rome. The Mediterranean now had two masters, both watching and maneuvering. Cleopatra understood this new order quickly. She had stayed neutral during the fights with Brutus and Cassius, but she had sent some grain and ships to the triumvirs. After Philippi, Antony summoned eastern rulers to Tarsus, modern Turkey, to secure their loyalty and tribute. Cleopatra was invited, or perhaps summoned, to explain her past neutrality and pledge support. How she arrived would become legend. Plutarch describes Cleopatra sailing up the Cydnus River to meet Antony in spectacular fashion. She came dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, to Egyptians, Isis, aboard a barge with purple sails, silver oars, and music drifting across the water. Perfume filled the air. Servants dressed as cupids attended her. Antony, famed for his love of spectacle and pleasure, was enthralled. This was no timid client queen, but a monarch with wealth, culture, and charisma to match his own. The meeting was more than seduction. Cleopatra knew Antony needed resources. His Parthian campaign was looming, and his hold over the East depended on money. Egypt could supply grain, gold, and ships. Antony knew Cleopatra could stabilize the Eastern Mediterranean. Their personal attraction, widely recorded, merged with mutual self-interest. Within months, Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, with Antony at her side. Antony spent the winter of 41 to 40 BCE in Egypt, living with Cleopatra in a style that Roman writers later mocked as decadent. But this was also politics. He was consolidating the East, rewarding a key ally, and enjoying Egypt's wealth and security. Cleopatra, for her part, secured Antony's recognition of Caesarion as her co-ruler and possibly Caesar's son, a subtle but powerful move to elevate her dynasty. She also gained territories from Antony, expanding her control along the Eastern Mediterranean. Their relationship produced 3 children: Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and later, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Antony granted Cleopatra large swaths of land, parts of Syria, Phoenicia, and Cyprus, reviving something like the old Ptolemaic Empire. These donations of Alexandria, as they were later called, would become explosive propaganda in Rome. To many Romans, it seemed Antony was giving away Roman-conquered lands to a foreign queen and her children. Antony returned to Roman politics several times, marrying Octavian's sister Octavia in 40 BCE as part of a temporary peace deal. But he eventually drifted back to Cleopatra and Alexandria, alienating Octavian. Their partnership became the defining challenge to Octavian's power. Antony needed Cleopatra's wealth to fund his ambitions. Cleopatra needed Antony's armies to keep Egypt independent. In 36 BCE, Antony launched a grand campaign against Parthia, Rome's eastern rival, using Cleopatra's funds and supplies. The expedition failed disastrously. Harsh weather, poor logistics, and Parthian tactics decimated his army. Antony retreated, humiliated and weakened, increasingly dependent on Cleopatra's resources to rebuild his strength. This deepened his bond with her but eroded his standing in Rome. Octavian seized the propaganda advantage. In Rome, he painted Antony as a man bewitched by an Eastern queen, abandoning Roman virtue for luxury and betrayal. Cleopatra was cast as a dangerous seductress plotting to rule Rome through Antony. This image, part smear campaign, part xenophobia, would endure for centuries, shaping how history remembers her. Despite the growing storm, Antony and Cleopatra reached their zenith in 34 BCE. At Alexandria, in a lavish ceremony, Antony distributed eastern territories to Cleopatra and their children. Caesarion was declared King of Kings, a title hinting at imperial ambition. Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Kings. For Octavian, this was perfect ammunition. He presented Antony as giving away Rome's conquests to foreigners and planning a new dynasty in Alexandria. Meanwhile, Octavian consolidated control in Rome. He commanded loyalty from Italy's veterans and the Senate, wielded Caesar's name as heir, and launched relentless propaganda. He highlighted Antony's divorce from Octavia, Octavian's sister, as betrayal of family and Roman values. He circulated stories of Cleopatra's excess and Antony's submission to her will. Rome, he argued, was under threat from an Eastern monarch and her lover. By 32 BCE, the alliance was broken. Octavian forced the Senate to declare war not directly on Antony, still a Roman citizen and consul, but on Cleopatra, framing the conflict as Rome versus a foreign queen. This clever move made Antony look like Cleopatra's puppet rather than a rival Roman. The final showdown came at Actium, a naval battle off Greece in 31 BCE. Antony and Cleopatra assembled a vast fleet, but Octavian's admiral Agrippa cut off their supply lines and harassed their ships. Disease and desertion weakened their forces. In September, the decisive clash unfolded. Cleopatra commanded part of the fleet and remained near Antony during the fight. When her squadron broke through a gap to escape, Antony followed. a move later seen as flight and betrayal, though it may have been planned to save the royal pair. The battle ended in disaster. Octavian's navy crushed the remaining ships. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt with a shattered force. Their power base collapsed as allies surrendered or defected. The dream of a revived Eastern Empire under their joint rule was over. For Cleopatra, Actium was not just a military loss, but a collapse of strategy. She had bet on Antony, as she once bet on Caesar. But this time, her ally had failed. Antony was still a great general, but lacked Caesar's discipline and political cunning. Octavian outmaneuvered them with propaganda, patience, and naval skill. Now Egypt stood alone against the rising master of Rome. Yet Cleopatra did not surrender immediately. Back in Alexandria, she prepared defenses, raised ships, and tried to negotiate. She still had wealth and the symbolic link to Caesar through Caesarion. But Octavian was relentless, determined to finish Rome's last civil war and present himself as savior of the Republic. The lovers who had once dazzled the Mediterranean were now cornered, facing the end not only of their personal ambitions, but of an entire era of independent Hellenistic kingdoms. The next chapter would be tragedy, betrayal, suicide, and the birth of Rome's empire under a new name, Augustus. In the autumn of 34 BCE, after the crushing defeat at Actium, the great gamble of Cleopatra and Mark Antony lay in ruins. Their fleet was scattered, their allies melted away, and Rome, now unified under Octavian, was coming for them. Yet the story did not end with the battle. It turned into one of the ancient world's most dramatic finales. A fight for survival, frantic diplomacy, betrayal, and the deaths that would echo through history. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria, still the jewel of the Nile, with its harbor, palaces, and wealth. But it was now a city cut off from the Mediterranean network they had once commanded. Octavian moved carefully, consolidating support before marching east. He knew the power of narrative. Rome had been told this war was against a foreign queen, not a fellow Roman. His propaganda cast Antony as a man enslaved by Cleopatra's charms, abandoning Roman honor. Octavian positioned himself as savior of tradition, protector of Italy, and defender against Eastern decadence. Every day Antony stayed with Cleopatra in Egypt fed this story. Inside Alexandria, the lovers faced grim reality. Antony tried to rally his remaining troops, but desertions mounted. Some officers defected, hoping to win Octavian's pardon. Cleopatra, ever pragmatic, reopened secret negotiations. She sent envoys to Octavian, offering to abdicate for her children or even rule jointly under Roman oversight. She may have hoped her immense wealth, Egypt still possessed deep reserves of grain and gold, could buy terms. Octavian listened but gave no promises. His strategy was patience and psychological warfare. Antony's mental state deteriorated. Once a brilliant soldier, he now faced isolation and humiliation. His Roman allies were gone. His image at home was shattered. Ancient sources, colored by Octavian's later propaganda, describe him as torn between pride and despair. Cleopatra remained focused on survival, preparing ships and treasure, perhaps as escape insurance. But Octavian's fleet controlled the seas. The net was tightening. By the summer of 3011 BCE, Octavian invaded Egypt. His forces advanced with little resistance. Many of Antony's remaining commanders surrendered without a fight. Cleopatra withdrew to her mausoleum, a lavish tomb she had built in advance, and stocked it with gold, jewels, and treasures. It was both fortress and symbolic message. She would not be paraded in a Roman triumph. Antony attempted one last stand. Hearing false rumors that Cleopatra had killed herself to avoid capture, he was overcome with despair. In the ancient Roman tradition of noble suicide, he fell on his own sword. But the wound did not kill him immediately. Servants carried him, bleeding, to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where she had barricaded herself. According to Plutarch, he died in her arms, a tragic end for a man who had once ruled half the known world. Cleopatra was now alone, facing Octavian. She met him personally, hoping to charm or negotiate as she had once done with Caesar and Antony. But Octavian was no romantic. He was cold, methodical, and young, but already a master of image. He intended to bring Egypt under Rome's control and parade his victory in triumph. Cleopatra, brilliant but desperate, tried every tactic: submission, wealth, even the idea of abdication for her children. Octavian remained polite but unmoved. He planned to take her alive to Rome, a living trophy to display in the streets, humiliation for the queen who had dared oppose him. For Cleopatra, this was unbearable. She had lived her entire reign preserving Egypt's dignity under the shadow of Rome. To be dragged in chains through Rome's forums was worse than death. She arranged her end with careful ritual. On August 12th, 30th of BCE, in her late 30s, Cleopatra dressed regally, feasted, and died, most likely by poison, though the legend speaks of an asp, the sacred Egyptian cobra, brought in a basket of figs. Her 2 attendants died with her. Whether snake or vial, the message was clear. The last pharaoh chose her own fate. Octavian, arriving too late to stop her, was furious but impressed. He allowed her to be buried with Antony, a gesture of respect, or perhaps propaganda, presenting himself as magnanimous conqueror. With Cleopatra dead, Egypt was annexed as a Roman province, placed under the personal control of Octavian rather than the Senate. Its immense wealth, grain, gold, and trade routes flowed directly into his hands, funding the regime he would soon transform into an empire. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, was briefly declared king by Egyptian loyalists. Octavian had him killed. "Too many Caesars," he reportedly said. Cleopatra's other children by Antony, however, were spared and taken to Rome to be raised in Octavia's household, a calculated act of clemency that neutralized threats while showcasing Octavian's humanity. Back in Rome, Octavian staged his triumph in 29 BCE. He paraded spoils from Egypt, but not Cleopatra. Her suicide had denied him that spectacle. Still, he wielded her memory masterfully. His poets and propagandists, like Horace and later Virgil, cast her as the archetypal dangerous Eastern queen, a foreign temptress who had tried to corrupt a great Roman and bring Eastern despotism to the heart of the Republic. Antony, once celebrated, became a cautionary tale, a general undone by love and luxury. This narrative served Octavian well. He could claim that he had saved Rome from a foreign queen's tyranny, even as he quietly dismantled the Republic himself. In 27 BCE, he took the title Augustus, becoming Rome's first emperor. The Republic was dead, but Octavian framed his new rule as restoration and protection, a clever mask for monarchy. Cleopatra's defeat helped justify his rise. Rome had faced and destroyed the Eastern threat. Now, a strong leader kept it safe. Cleopatra's real story was far more complex than this Roman myth. She was not a mere seductress, but a shrewd, multilingual strategist trying to preserve her dynasty in a world dominated by Rome's armies. She revived Egypt's economy, restored its temples, and played a dangerous diplomatic game. She gambled first on Caesar and won, gambled on Antony and lost. She ruled for 2 decades in one of history's most dangerous geopolitical environments and nearly succeeded in keeping Egypt independent. Yet her legacy was reshaped by her enemies. Roman historians, poets, and later European dramatists loved the tale of the exotic queen who doomed great men. Shakespeare immortalized her tragedy with poetry, but also reinforced stereotypes born from Octavian's propaganda. Only in modern scholarship has Cleopatra begun to emerge again as the intelligent ruler she was, a survivor who mastered politics but could not outplay Rome's eventual unification under Augustus. Antony's fate was equally tragic. A talented soldier and charismatic leader, he lacked Caesar's discipline and Octavian's cold calculation. His love for Cleopatra, genuine but also strategic, became political suicide in Rome's xenophobic climate. His death marked not just the fall of a man, but the end of a generation of Roman civil wars. With their deaths, an era closed. The independent Hellenistic kingdoms that had followed Alexander were gone. Rome ruled the Mediterranean unchallenged. Egypt, for millennia, a world power, became a province, rich but voiceless, its pharaohs replaced by Roman prefects. Yet the allure of Cleopatra and Antony's final stand endured. Their lives, woven from ambition, love, and power, became symbols of defiance and tragedy. Octavian, soon Augustus, emerged as the supreme victor. He took Egypt's treasures, fed Rome with its grain, and used the story of Cleopatra's threat to consolidate his regime. The Republic was buried alongside her. In its place rose an empire that would last for centuries. The last queen of Egypt chose death over humiliation, and in doing so, denied her conqueror one final triumph. Her legend, though twisted by propaganda, has outlived Augustus's careful image-making. Even today, Cleopatra's name evokes intelligence, power, and the peril of confronting a rising superpower. Her story with Caesar and Antony was never just romance. It was the struggle of an ancient civilization to survive the birth of Rome's empire, and a reminder that history is written as much by victors as by those who dared to resist.